Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the semifinals in the Freestyle Goat Chess Challenge being held in Wiesenhaus, Germany. Now, yesterday, Magnus Carlsen, the former world chess champion in regular chess, made a huge comeback against Alireza Firouzja from France, and he was able to advance to the semifinals. Now, today in the semifinals, he's playing against none other than the rising Uzbek junior. Maybe he's not a junior anymore, but I assume he still is. Norbek Abdussatorov, who's had some fantastic results in the past year to year and a half. So without further ado, let's jump right into the action. Now, as always, the players are playing Fischer random chess with the pieces on the back rank arranged in a random order. Now, you'll notice one thing right off, which is that first of all, you have a rook on the same original square, you have a queen and a king, which are in the two squares in the middle of the board here, and you also have a rook on the f file. Now, as you'll notice from past videos, generally when I look at the positions, there are a couple things that I look at. Do you want to push a pawn in the center of the board? Now, with both a queen and a rook on the e and the f file, it makes a lot of sense to push either the e pawn or the f pawn. Pushing the d pawn, while there's nothing specifically wrong with it, doesn't feel right since you have a king here, which is not guarding the pawn. As we know, the king can only move one space at a time. So that's what you tend to think of, but here Magnus comes up with a different idea to start the game, which is he plays the move 1 to g4, also known as the legendary Grob opening with the pieces on their original squares. Now, g4 is a very interesting move here for a couple of reasons. First of all, if black plays f5, for example, white can take, and after takes, knight g3, you gain a tempo, bringing the knight into the game, and now after f4 and e4, white already is claiming a big portion of the central squares. So it potentially stops black from playing f5, taking space in the center of the board to activate the bishop and the rook. Additionally, here you want to bring the knight to g3 on the next turn, and the knight can go to either f5, e4, or h5. So we get g4. Now, to point out, in the other semifinal match between Levon Aronian and Fabiano Caruana, Levon did open with a more traditional move e4, and I believe the game went e4, e5, knight g3, and f6 here to open up the long diagonal for the light square bishop. Nonetheless, Magnus Carlsen goes for g4. Norbek does play e5. We get knight to g3, and now we have f6 here. Black builds a chain of 3 pawns here in the center of the board. He also opens up scope for the bishop on g8 as well. And here Magnus plays the move d4. Now, d4 is a very, very enterprising move from Magnus Carlsen. He's sacrificing a pawn in the middle of the board, and he's hoping that he'll get enough counterplay. Now, Norbek here decides to play this move knight b6, and one of the great things about Fischer random chess is that when you play Fischer random, you don't really know whether the moves are good or bad. You simply have to evaluate the position from the very get-go, and this is another reason that in recent times, I've actually learned to have more respect for some of the former players like Paul Morphy, Wilhelm Steinitz, Emanuel Lasker, etc. All the guys who used to play chess before modern-day chess theory was developed, because when they play chess from move number 1, it's not too different from when we play Fischer random now, where you think a move might be good, but you really have no idea what is good, what is bad, and you just have to figure out every single move. So after d4, Norbek does play the move knight b6. He does not grab the pawn. Now, the computer actually really does not like this move, because after takes, if white goes knight f5 to fork the pawns on g7 and d4, black can sack a pawn back with c5, protecting the pawn on d4. And if you take on g7, now after queen g6, knight f5, and queen takes g4, black is simply up a pawn. Now, the reason Norbek probably didn't do this, he was most likely afraid of the move queen to b4, hitting the pawns on b7 and d4, as well as the rook on f8. But here the computer suggests a very cold-blooded move b6 here to guard the pawn, and after queen takes pawn, black can play d5 followed by c5, and the two b's come into action, and black also gets a big black center to boot. Norbek, however, decides to play the move knight b6, and now Magnus goes knight d3, again offering the pawn on d4. But here, if Norbek were to take the pawn on d4, now after f3 here, trying to win the pawn on d4, black no longer has ideas with c5, because the knight covers that square, and so white will be able to recapture the pawn on d4. So Norbek goes d6, Magnus plays f3, opening up the diagonal for the dark square bishop here, and intending to potentially play e4 to build a big white center. Norbek takes on d4, we get bishop takes pawn, and now the move c5. Now, already here, as I was reviewing the game before I started the recap, I felt like somewhere around here is where Norbek lost a little bit of the thread. I don't know if d6 was necessarily a bad move, but it felt to me that something like d5 potentially, or maybe even something like c6 perhaps made a little bit more sense than playing d6, because now in this position, if Norbek doesn't play c5, it's very hard to activate this dark square bishop. And while the computer thinks c5 is okay, you have to be extremely precise, and the bishop can very easily become a bad piece behind all these pawns. So we get the move c4 here from Norbek, which the computer doesn't actually hate, but but it's not a move that I really like because the resulting position after takes and knight b4, while black has the two B's here, they're very, very passive. Even if you get d5 here, you have a somewhat open diagonal for the dark square bishop, but the bishop on g8 is very passive behind these two pawns. On top of that, after we get the move c3 as in the game here, white can potentially try to put pressure on the pawn on d5. You have the double pawns on b7 and b6, and white can also try to get a bastion or an outpost by putting this knight on d4. And I think that if you're not a silicon beast, a computer like Stockfish or Leela, it's very, very hard to play this position for black, even though the objective evaluation is completely fine. So we get bishop f4 from Noterbeck here, trying to stop Magnus from castling the king to the queen side, and also intending to castle himself and or put a bishop on e3, potentially to stop white from pushing pawns in the center of the board. So after bishop f4, Magnus plays knight to h5, attacking the bishop and the pawn at the same time. Noterbeck goes back to guard the pawn on g7, and now Magnus plays f4 to close the door on this diagonal for the bishop on h6. Here we get castles from Noterbeck, and now Magnus plays knight back to g3, and Noterbeck plays this very surprising move g6. Now I'm very surprised he played this move. The computer is screaming for this move d4, and the reason that I think Noterbeck rejected this move is that white can check the king, and after the king moves, white can castle the queen out of the center of the board. Computer still thinks after queen e3 and queen d2, for example, after takes, g6, black is probably okay here, and this would have been for choice. Instead, Noterbeck plays g6 here, stopping either knight to f5 or bishop to f5 in the position. But now Magnus is able to play e3, which guards the pawn on f4, but also with the pawns on c3 and e3 stops black from pushing this pawn, which means that the light square bishop on g8 is now a very, very passive piece. And at this point, I feel like Magnus Carlsen has a serious advantage. Now, again, computer will play it perfectly, but from the human perspective, I just feel like black's plans are too difficult here. Very passive bishop on the light squares here. You've got a knight on h8 that's completely out of the game. You don't have a pawn push, and you have these double pawns on b7 and b6. So we get queen d7 here. Magnus plays queen to e2 to guard the pawn on g4. We get rook fe8 here, trying to put pressure on the pawn on e3 and the pawn on f4 as well. Magnus plays knight to c2 here. We get bishop to f8, and now b4 is played here. Now b4 is a move that Magnus plays because he wants to go knight to d4, but if he plays it right away, black can potentially go bishop c5, trading off this dark square bishop for the knight on the d4 square. So we get b4, very committal move, of course, because it stops bishop c5. But black plays the move bishop e6. Now this, again, not a move that I like, but it's very hard for black to play, because if you play en passant, after pawn takes and pawn takes, now white suddenly has an open file for the rook to infiltrate, and if you don't take, white gets a square on d4 and you never have bishop c5. So Noterbeck goes bishop e6. Now we get h3 here, and at this point I already feel like Magnus is well in control, because he's going to get this knight to d4, and he can play bishop c2 and castles to the queen side, and I think that it's just very difficult. So Noterbeck here goes h5. Magnus plays knight to d4, and now we get the move pawn takes pawn, and Magnus sacks the pawn temporarily, but plays this great move f5 here, putting pressure on the bishop on e6. We get bishop to f7. If black were to take, for example, after takes, it's uh-oh spaghetti time. There are all kinds of problems on this diagonal. This light square b is going to win either the rook or the queen down the road. So we get bishop to f7. Magnus takes back. Now Noterbeck goes queen c7, and we get this move queen f3. If Noterbeck were to play bishop h6 to pressure the pawn on e3 here, white can simply go rook f3 guarding the pawn, followed by bishop c2 and castling to the queen side. And with this jumbo horse on d4, again, jumbo horse on d4, very bad light square bishop behind the pawns, and this knight in the corner of the board doing nothing. All roads lead to a victory for Magnus. So we get queen c7, queen to f3 played here. Rook f3 also decent here, but now with queen f3, if black goes bishop d6, you can move the knight back to e2 potentially. If you go rook f3 here, maybe there's a trick with bishop d6 forcing you to move this knight to a different square. So we get queen f3, and now bishop to h6 played by Noterbeck. Magnus plays rook to e1. We get bishop to g5, and now we have this move a4. Now at this point, I would say that out of this opening phase of the game, it's very clear that Magnus Carlsen has a serious advantage. Great knight on d4. It's supported by the pawns. Black has this terrible light square bishop behind this pawn chain. So this bastion and black's weak light square bishop and the knight in the corner pocket, and ideas like a5, a6 to open up the a file, it's just looking very bad for Noterbeck at this point in the game. So we get g takes f5 here. What Noterbeck trying to do, he's trying to activate the bishop. If white takes with the pawn, maybe at some point you can go bishop h5 down the road and bring the bishop into the game. So we get the move, bishop takes f5 check, king to b8, and now Magnus plays rook to e2. And here Noterbeck is actually able to play knight g6, and suddenly the computer thinks that Noterbeck's back in the game because this very, very passive knight on h8 is suddenly able to jump to e5 or h4, and you have an open file potentially to use on the h file if you swing the rook over to the square. So it's looking like Noterbeck is maybe back in the game, but it's still very difficult to play from a human perspective. Magnus trades for the knight, and now he goes knight g to f5. And what Magnus is arguing here is that D's knights are better than D's bishops. Basically, black has a bishop on g5 that can't really do a whole lot. It's putting a little bit of pressure on the pawn on e3, but this pawn is guarded by both the rook, the knight, and the queen here, and the bishop can't go anywhere else because the knight covers these two other squares on the board. So while the computer thinks it's okay, it's very tricky to play because the knights cover so many crucial squares. So we get the move queen to e5. Magnus now goes a5 here. We got queen to e4, and this is a mistake here. Computer wants takes first and then queen to e4. I suspect the reason Noterbeck did not do this is probably he was worried about something like queen to g3 here or something of this nature, or maybe thought there was like queen g3 and maybe a rook to a2 idea. But computer says after a move like queen d3, black is actually winning here. Nonetheless, Noterbeck's feeling some of the Magnus effect. He decides to play queen e4, and now after trade and a takes b6, suddenly black is in real trouble here. Their ideas like rook to a2 to go for the double stack and checkmate. King on b8 is boxed in by this pawn on b6, and therefore Noterbeck is going to have to be very, very precise if he wants to avoid losing the game. So we get the move rook takes g4 being played, and now Magnus plays rook to a2. We get rook g1, king e2, rook takes rook, and now Noterbeck has dodged the checkmate on the a8 square. On the other hand, however, he still has this problem. This dark square bishop cannot move anywhere. It's dominated by these knights here. They cover all the critical squares, and white still has ideas like rook a5 or rook to h1. So Noterbeck plays rook to e8, and now Magnus goes rook to h1, ensuring that black cannot kick the knight out of f5 with rook to e5, because then white might have ideas like rook to h8, trying to checkmate the black king. So we get rook to f8 here from Noterbeck, and now Magnus plays this move knight d6, and Noterbeck resigns very, very abruptly. And you're probably thinking, wait, what just happened? It was completely fine. You see the bar, it's fine. The reason Noterbeck resigns the game, or actually what I should say, the reason that he resigned, or what he should have gone for, was he should have traded this bishop for the knight and then played this move bishop to f4, activating the bishop to where it can go back to this e5 square here after rook h4, bishop e5, knight e7, and f5. Computer thinks that black is okay here because after knight takes pawn, you have rook to d8, bishop covers the square on h8, and now the pawn on c3 is under serious pressure. Again, very, very difficult to see. It's not an easy thing to spot. But the problem is that when Noterbeck plays rook f8 and knight to d6, the reason he has to resign the game here is these knights are way too powerful. First of all, if black plays a move like rook to d8 to attack the knight, white has knight to e6, attacking the rook. If you take, we get the classic back rank checkmate here, where the king has no squares. You block, but again, king cannot move forward. So this means you can't really play rook to d8, but then what can you do? A logical move would be bishop d3, king to d2. But here the bishop on g5 still has no squares that it can move to. If you play a move like rook g8, white can again go knight to e6. And effectively the reason that you're just lost, if you play a move like bishop g6, which is a waiting move, white has knight to c5 here, and white's threatening to set up the classic Anastasia checkmate. If you go rook to d8, I go knight d7, checking the king. If you take, it's the same mate here with rook takes rook. And if you go king to a8, now there's rook to a1, checkmating the king on the open a file as the king has no squares available. So in this position, Noterbeck simply can't do anything. He's just stuck basically. And this idea of knight e6, knight c5, knight d7 is really unpreventable. Maybe there's some other, like rook g8, knight e6, I'm trying to think, maybe you can go bishop e8 to try and, actually this is one way to try and stop it, but if you go bishop e8, now there's rook to h7, hitting the pawn on b7, and after bishop c6 and b5, again, these knights are just way too powerful here, and black is going to lose the game very shortly. The two knights and the rook are very active, black's b's are just doing nothing, and it's just all hopeless. So Noterbeck resigns this game, which means that Magnus jumps out to a 1-0 lead in the match. A very, very short, kind of abrupt game. Seemed like it was a game, and then suddenly it was over. Magnus Carlsen, I have to point out, is one of these players who really, really loves the bishop pair, the two bishops. But in this game, he illustrates why, in some cases, two knights can be better. And very specifically, if we go back a few moves, the reason that the situations where two knights can be better than two bishops are generally positions which are very close. The pawn structure is close in the center of the board. There aren't many open files. And if you get such a situation like this, where a bishop can't move, especially, the knights are just simply a better combination than the two bishops. Mind you, it's it's fairly rare to see two knights be much better than two bishops, but it does happen. And that's one of the great things about chess, is that there are sometimes general themes, but they don't always hold true. It depends on the placement of the pawns, all the other pieces in the game, and for that reason, Magnus Carlsen shows one of the examples where two knights are much better than two bishops. So Magnus Carlsen wins his first game of classical Fischer Random Chess to move out to a 1-0 lead. Tomorrow they will play game number 2. Now Noterbeck will be in a situation where he must win against Magnus with the white pieces. If Noterbeck does not win tomorrow against Magnus, that means that Magnus will advance to the grand final, where he will play either the winner of the match between Levon Aroni or Fabiano Caruana. Now Levon did win game 1 today with the white pieces as well, so Fabiano will have to come back and win tomorrow with the white pieces. Fabiano does not win, Levon is in the final. If Fabiano wins, there could potentially be a second tiebreaker as well, but it should be very interesting to see what happens on the second day of the semifinal matches in the Freestyle Goat Chess Challenge being held in Wiesenhaus, Germany. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of the game that Magnus Carlsen crushes Noterbeck Abdussatorov in the first game of the classical Fischer Random semifinal match here. If you have not already subscribed to my channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and I will be back tomorrow with a recap after an explosive second day in the semifinals of the Freestyle Goat Chess Challenge being held in Wiesenhaus, Germany. See you guys soon. Hope you enjoy the recap. Bye.